Hello there to everyone out there in the IB virtual world. I'm Lance King, welcome to my session. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you and your families are well and safe. These are crazy times we're living in right now, aren't they? But it looks like there's a vaccine on the horizon, so hopefully we'll be through this nightmare fairly soon. This session is going to be a little bit different because what I want to do is I want to describe to you how I would design a good quality post-pandemic ATL skills program. But in order to do that, what I have to do is I have to take you back on a journey, the journey to how I got to where I am today. So if you'll indulge me for a little while, I'll take you through my process and my progress, I guess. It all started back in 1985 when I got my very first teaching job. This was in what in New Zealand we call a polytechnic, kind of like a technical university. And I had food technology qualifications and quite a lot of experience in industry. And so I took a job teaching students who came out of the dairy industry, young adults. They were on an intensive course between 3 and 6 months to learn all the processing factors that went into processing in the food industry. And so I was teaching them engineering, and I was teaching them microbiology, and I was teaching them dairy product processing, a whole range of science-based subjects. And I really enjoyed it. I got to know the students really well. But one thing I noticed fairly early on in my career was I noticed the disparity between results between individual students. And some were achieving at the very highest level and some were barely scraping by. And I investigated that, and it seemed to me there wasn't a direct connection between the results they were producing and what seemed to me to be their natural intelligence or ability. And when I investigated, I discovered, it seems completely obvious now, that the best students were the ones who had the best strategies. They were the ones who could listen and concentrate really well in class, who could take home the notes that I gave them and review them on a regular basis, who could summarize that information, who could prepare assignments well, manage their time and tasks effectively. And it wasn't long before I realized that the difference between students was a process difference, not an intelligence difference. And so I started to incorporate what we now call ATL skills into my lessons back in 1986 probably was when I started. And I started incorporating into my lessons sub-lessons, if you like, on time management, on note-making and summarizing, on even things like remembering, on building in review schedules for going over information, on preparing for exams and study skills, all those kinds of things. And it wasn't long, after about 1 year of doing this, all the results of my students went up. And they continued to go up for the next 5 years. And the results I was producing were way beyond results that had ever been produced before. And this eventually was noticed by other people in the Polytechnic. And I got seconded to what was called the Professional Development Unit, where I enjoyed 5 years of teaching teachers about teaching and teaching teachers how to incorporate the same kinds of strategies that I had used into their lessons. How to give students the process efficiencies and capabilities they needed in order to manage the information and the tests and the tasks that they were given. And I worked away at that for about 5 years, but I didn't feel I was really getting the transfer to the teachers that I was looking for. And so in 1995, I left the Polytechnic sector, left the formal education sector completely, and set up my own business called The Art of Learning, and set out within New Zealand schools to teach students in schools the mechanisms of how to learn effectively and how to learn efficiently. But I wasn't just teaching students. The thing that I realized early on was the multifaceted nature of learning in a school environment and how many players there are in that. And so what I was offering to schools was a 5-hour, like one full school day workshop for students, groups of 30, sometimes 50. I've even done workshops with students of up to 100 in a group, but generally it was small groups, 30 or so. 5 hours with students, followed by an after-school workshop for teachers for an hour, followed by an evening seminar for parents of the students I'd worked with. And I discovered that when you put all three players together, the students, the teachers and the parents, and you make sure they're all getting the same message about how important the process skills are, then our results were great. And I got my business launched, and I was underway. I mean, it's interesting to think back, because at that time there was no one else doing what I did, not a single person. In fact, I've rarely discovered anyone in the world who does quite what I do. But it was a very unique business, and it was reasonably successful. It obviously takes a while to get yourself established in a market, especially a market as small as New Zealand. But at the time, I was offering a fairly simple package of learning skills, as I called them. And I was focused mostly on time management, on task management, on note making, on summarizing, on review, on memory, on exam technique, exam scheduling, and I did some work on exam nerves and things like that. But at the time I was quite well read. I was reading very widely. I was looking at the work of people like Colin Rose and Eric Jensen, who were doing similar things overseas. I was looking at multiple intelligences by Gardner. But more interestingly, it was the work of Martin Seligman, positive psychology from the United States, and Carol Dweck, who back then was involved mostly in motivational and attributional research. And I was keeping up with all those, but I was trying to work out ways to incorporate them into my class. And so I developed a few little exercises, and one was around juggling. And this was really fascinating, because what happened was probably in about 1996, I think, I had a seminal experience. I had an experience in class which changed the way I did everything from then on. And this was in a school in a small town in New Zealand called Ngaruahia. And I arrived at the school early in the morning as normal, and started to get myself set up. And before too long, the students started to arrive and started to sit down at the desks that I'd arranged. And I noticed one young woman in particular. And the thing I noticed about her was that her clothes were dirty and her hair was dirty. And I thought that was very odd. But anyway, she sat down, she sat at the back of the class, and we got into the exercises, and we got into all the stuff that I was doing. And she didn't contribute at all, but she was sitting there and she was writing down what she needed to write down, I think. And we got to an exercise that I do, which is a visualization exercise. You're probably familiar with the sort of thing. You get students to do a certain stretch, and then you get them to close their eyes and visualize and imagine themselves stretching further. And when they open their eyes, they can stretch further. It's a really good exercise to show the power of suggestion and how we can overcome barriers that we're not even aware are there. But anyway, to do this, I get the students to stand up, so they all stood up. And I explained the exercise, and I got them to do the first stretch physically with their eyes open. And then I asked them to close their eyes. And we were going to do the visualization. So they all dutifully closed their eyes, except this girl. She was standing at the back, and she would not close her eyes. Now, I'm a teacher, so I try and get people to do what I want, which is, so I'd say, in normal circumstance, I'd say, okay, I'll start the visualization when everyone's got their eyes closed. When everyone's got their eyes closed, we'll get started on the visualization. And I did this a couple of times, and she wouldn't close her eyes. And I looked carefully at her, and I noticed that she was afraid. She was afraid to close her eyes. So I thought, whoa, something going on here. So I just ignored that and went through the exercise with everyone else, and they had their eyes closed, so they didn't see that she didn't. And we got through the exercise, and she didn't really participate, and everyone sat down. So then it was break time. And they went out into the playground, and I went off to the staff room, and I was talking to one of the teachers, and I mentioned this girl to the teacher. And the teacher said, yes, sorry, I should have told you about it. She's a really sad case. She's had a history in her family of sexual and physical abuse. And she said the situation has been resolved now. She's with a different family. It's all okay now. But this girl, she's at school, which is great, but she does not participate. She does not contribute, and she does not smile. Terribly sad case. So armed with that information, I went back to the class again. So working away in the class and doing what I can. And we get to the juggling exercise. Now, I've designed this juggling exercise to try and show students how simple strategies can overcome their own resistance and their own feeling that they can't do things. And it goes in several steps. So I got all the students up and I gave them 3 juggling balls each. Yes, by then I was carrying a bag full of juggling balls around to every school. And so they get 3 balls each. And we start off with the 1 ball task. I'll step back a little here so you can see what I'm saying. So I get 1 ball. And this girl picked up 1 ball and she was able to do 1 ball, no problem at all. Okay. So then I moved to the 2 ball stage, which I call throw, throw, catch, catch, throw, throw, catch, catch. And she did that, and that was no problem. And she could do that. That was easy. No problem. And then I said, okay, so now we're going to go to the 3 ball stage, which involves this step. And everyone starts trying it except this girl. She's got the 3 balls sitting on a desk. And I said to her, what's up? Are you going to try? And she said, no, I can't do that. And I said, see, I was all on about suggestion and language. I said, are you sure it's a can't? Is it maybe just a haven't yet? Maybe you just haven't done it yet. She said, no, I can't. You sure you can't? I was trying to be as gentle as possible, but hoping that she would make the connection and make the shift. And she said, no, I can't. I said, are you sure you can't do it? Are you sure it's not just a haven't yet? In the end, she says, oh, all right, okay, I haven't yet. Are you happy? I haven't yet. And then she did it. And she smiled. And in that moment, the whole world changed. Her world changed because she learnt that a simple verbal strategy could actually make a change in her emotional state. And that was an extraordinary thing, I think, for her to learn in that moment. And my world changed because I learnt in that moment that it is possible to teach affective skills. I don't know that teach is exactly the right word, but it is possible to help students to learn to manage or have some influence or some control over their emotional state. And that was a big moment because for me, from then on, about 1996 onwards, I have always included a lot of dealing with the emotional state, dealing with the affective base, looking at resilience and perseverance and self-motivation and emotional management. All those things have become, throughout my life since then, the most important part of my teaching. And so that was a big moment. And from then on, my courses just went up a notch in terms of effect. And I eventually, in New Zealand, had 6 people on the road running these courses around the country. And we were very, very successful for a while. What happened after a few years of that probably 1999, thereabouts, maybe 2000, I guess, the government changed its funding strategies, and we were going through austerity programs, and so they reduced the funding to schools, and so funding available for bringing people in from the outside like myself, that funding more or less disappeared. And so I had to start looking for other markets, and that's when I started looking overseas. The first market I looked at was England, because England has a similar educational system to New Zealand, but the school year is opposite to New Zealand. So when there was no work in New Zealand, like over the summer holidays, I thought there would probably be work in England. And so I marketed hard for 12 months of emails to every single contact I had and every single connection I could make. And finally, someone picked me up. And this was a guy who was a superintendent of the Greenwich borough schools. He had 14 high schools under his control or his supervision, and they were the 14 worst performing schools in the whole of the London area. And so I guess he was at the bottom of the barrel, and what can we possibly do? And tell you what, let's get this crazy bald guy from New Zealand over. He might be able to do something. So they got us in. I took one of the guys with me who'd been working with me on the road in New Zealand, and we went in to Greenwich, and he asked us to work in 10 of these 14 schools. Now, these schools were tough. These kids were tough. Most of them were not interested in education, not interested in learning. In fact, most of them, it seemed to me, were active terrorists in the classroom, and they would just take no notice of the teacher, and they'd be throwing things and desks and chairs and fighting with each other and just ignoring the teacher completely. And so we had a tough job. But we had all sorts of strategies that we could use, and we had lots of thinking games to play. So we decided that we could do it. I can remember one particular example. I'm in the classroom, I'm just getting set up in the morning, everyone's coming in and they're sitting down, they're eventually getting kind of settled down, and I'm just starting to teach, and there's a crash, and I look around, and this little guy, little, stocky, tough as nails, he's just kicked in the classroom doors, kicks in the doors, staggers into the classroom, swings his school bag around his head and lets it fly. It flies over the heads of the other students and crashes into a desk at the back. He comes stalking up to me at the front and says, "Who the f are you?" He said the word, I won't. And I said, "I'm Lance, how are you?" And that was the kind of thing we had to deal with all the time. It was tough. These were kids who lived in tenement housing, in housing estates, 36-story concrete block towers with no lifts and rubbish everywhere, and a graffiti everywhere, and all sorts of everything possibly nasty you can imagine. There were drugs, there was violence, we had knife fights in the school playgrounds, there were all sorts of terrible, terrible things. These children, it was not their fault, the fact that they weren't engaged with education. It was their circumstances were absolutely appalling. But interestingly enough, in every class there was always one or two who could see that education was the way out, was their ticket to getting out of the housing estate culture. And those two, talk about motivation. They didn't need to know how to motivate. They were pouring it on. What they wanted was simple, practical strategies. Okay, how do you concentrate well? How do you make good notes? How do you make good summaries? How do you review those so you remember them well? How do you manage your time and your tasks? How do you get yourself prepared for exams? All the very, very simple, basic stuff. And that worked pretty well. And they were 10 of the toughest days I've ever done, because the person I was over there with, his name was John. John and I, we had one day in each of these 10 schools, just one day. And in that one day, we had a 5-hour workshop with the students, followed by an hour with the teachers, followed by an hour and a half with the parents. Very few parents ever turned up, but that's what we did. And so 10 of the toughest days of my life. And then we finished off there and we flew home and wondered, what had actually, had it been worthwhile. And about 6 months later, after the students had sat GCS exams and the schools had got the results back and they'd been compiled and they were available and analysed, we created a report of the evidence that had been presented. And the amazing thing was, in the 4 schools that the superintendent hadn't got us to work in, the GCSE results were the same. They were the same as they always had been historically. But in the 10 schools that we worked in for one day, with one class each of students, all those 10 schools, their GCSE results had gone up. Every single one. And so it was a great success in its own way. And I eventually ended up designing a program that the teachers in those schools could do themselves, and gave them all the resources, and that's another story. And so England became my first regular overseas gig. I would go back there for 2 to 3 weeks every year and worked in a variety of schools. And so it was by about 2003 I found myself at the other end of the socio-economic spectrum, working in one of the most elite private, what they call public, boys' schools in the whole United Kingdom. And I still remember my first workshop there. I walked into the room, the boys were all sitting down, very quiet, very respectful. The master was in the back corner, and I started on the workshop. It was all very fine. And then the master had other things that he had to go and do. And once he left the room, the behaviour started to deteriorate, as it often does. And the boys started talking when I was talking and started flicking things at each other and doing all the normal kind of disruptive stuff. And then we got into the juggling activity, and the behaviour really started to deteriorate, and they were pushing each other over and they were fighting with each other, all sorts of things like this. And I got them back and got them sitting down, and I said to them, guys, what's going on? You know, when I came to the school, I was told that because of the nature of the school, you guys, some of you guys, will probably end up in significant business positions in the world when you're a bit older. Some of you will go into politics. Some of you may end up as leaders in this country. And yet, to me, I'm looking around at you and you just seem like the same 14-year-old ratbags that I have to deal with in every school I work in back in New Zealand. And I said, and what makes you different? And a little voice at the back pipes up and says, we're rich, sir. I laughed and laughed. That was just, I just couldn't help myself. And I said to them, and how's that going? You know, what's being rich like for you? And they started telling me about all their troubles, all their difficulties, and how terrible it was. And one of them, I remember, said, all the local girls think we're toffs. I don't really know what that means, but obviously it wasn't a positive thing. And so I discovered that these boys had the same problems as every 14-year-old boy I'd ever worked with. And it was a fascinating group of students, you know, different needs and requiring different focus. And as the master said, as we were walking to the class the first time around, he said, these boys have got a bit of a special problem. And I said, what's that? And he said, they've all got trust funds. In other words, they're going to come into money as soon as they leave school. So they have no real interest in GCSE. They're not really interested in passing. It's not going to give them anything at all. And all the extrinsic motivators aren't going to work. And so that's what we've got you in for. And so that was my challenge. So I imagine some of you have students like that yourselves. And so how do you motivate those that have no real need of qualifications, and certainly the monetary rewards of a good education are insignificant to them? How do you motivate them? Well, obviously, you've got to focus on intrinsic motivators. So I designed that entire program around being the very best you could possibly be. And thinking about the disappointment that you might feel. I use visualizations quite a bit in my courses. Think about the disappointments you might feel if, when you opened up that GCSE results envelope and you pulled out that page and you looked down the list of the results and they were way below what you thought you were capable of. How would that feel? And then teaching them lots and lots of strategies, all the things I've been talking about so far, with a particular focus on the affective, on the feeling base, on determination and perseverance and self-motivation, and then redoing the visualization with them pulling out the slip and seeing all the best possible results. And it seemed to work. You know, I was lucky enough to go back to that school for one day a year to work with just one class of the underachieving boys every year for 13 years. And the master sent me reports all the time, and he credited my course with helping them to improve their GCSE results every single year. And so that was also a success, but in a different way, using different strategies to the schools I was working in originally in London. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the explicit teaching of what we call ATL skills in a well-designed context can make a significant and measurable difference to exam results, even when it is done by an external provider coming in and not linking those skills necessarily to any subjects at all, just teaching the skills themselves. And so England, and in particular London schools, became my first successful overseas market. But England is a very long way to fly from New Zealand, so I started stopping off in Asia. In particular, I stopped in Bangkok because we had some friends there who I could stay with overnight on my travels through. And it didn't take long for me to start exploring Bangkok schools. A number of great IB schools in Bangkok, and I started working with students there and had some wonderful sessions with really interested and keen and smart Thai students especially. I really enjoyed working with them. And one of the schools I worked at was NIST. And at NIST at the time, the deputy principal there was a man named Malcolm Nicholson. And Malcolm saw me work with his students once a year for one day over several years, and then he made the shift to becoming the MYP Development Director at the IB head office, which at that time was in Wales. And Malcolm was always very interested in raising the prominence of ATL skills within the IB, and so he asked me to do some research on the academic evidence for the direct teaching of what we called ATL skills. And so I did that research for him, and I did other research, and that ended up with him asking me eventually to design the MYP ATL framework, which I did, which was released in the 2014 MYP Principles to Practices. Now, just as an aside, that framework that I originally produced back in 2014, when you look at it today, I think you'll see it's kind of big and clumsy. It's got 135 individual strands, and if you explore them, you'll notice that there's quite a bit of duplication there. There's quite a lot of crossover between strands, and the language is somewhat archaic now. So what I did at the beginning of this COVID situation we're in now, I had some time on my hands, so I went back and revised the 2014 framework, and I've created a new 2020 MYP ATL framework, and I've eliminated all the overlap, I've eliminated all the duplication, I've tidied up the language, I've kept all the clusters the same and all the categories the same and all the content the same. All I've done is I've thinned it down, so from 135 strands it's now down to 75 strands, which focus much more on what we really need to teach in a simplified way. And if you're interested, you're welcome to go to my website, taolearn.com, go to the ATL resources page, and there you'll find the what I'm calling my revised 2020 MYP ATL framework. And I've also broken that down because what I've done is I've extracted out of that what I consider to be the most significant strands for the effective remote learning. And the framework, I've just called it the Core ATL Skills Framework, and what remains out of that original full framework is the subject-specific framework. So you can see it there. You might find the Core Skills Framework to be very useful, because I think if we teach our students those particular skills, then remote learning becomes so much easier for them. So please feel free to go and have a look at that and pick it up if you wish. So I've had a wonderful career for the last 25 years. I've worked in over 300 schools in 37 countries, and in each school I've done more or less the same thing. A 5-hour whole day course for students, teaching them all the cognitive, metacognitive and affective skills they need for success at school, at university, and in every job they're going to ever take in the future. Followed up by 1 hour with teachers after school, making sure that they understand the process-focused approach to learning, followed by an evening seminar for parents to make sure they can support their children in achieving these goals. And you know, the most interesting thing is I've never ever come across one other person anywhere in the world who does exactly what I do. I'm sure those people exist somewhere, but I've never come across one. And by the way, if anyone out there watching this is interested in a similar career, just to get in touch with me, I'm happy to train people up in delivery of my entire program. All the connection details for myself will be at the end of this presentation. So that kind of brings us to today. I think that it is possible to make a significant difference for students by directly teaching them the skills they need to succeed. And of course, in a COVID-19 world, the skills they need are all the skills of self-managed learning. Which brings me right back again to the beginning of this presentation when I talked about my very first class of students in New Zealand. I mean, the thing that marked out the students that were successful was their ability to manage their own learning. And this is not going to be any more important than right now in a COVID environment where students are doing at least some of their work at home alone. And what are the key skills they need for that? And I think there's some principles and practices that we can put in place to help those students succeed in this unusual learning environment. One of the first things I've noticed some teachers doing, which I don't think necessarily is a good thing, is insisting that students work alone. Now, one of the biggest difficulties of remote learning is loneliness. Kids get lonely when they're working at home alone on their own computer. And if teachers insist on that, I don't think that's a useful thing. In fact, I think teachers should insist that students, when they're working in a lesson that is being presented by a teacher or when they're working on their own, I think teachers should insist that students have a phone propped up next to the laptop or something like that, and making sure that they're on a chat room with their buddy who is working on exactly the same material as they're working on. If you can encourage them to set that up, maybe someone needs to invent a little stand that will sit next to a laptop that you can prop your phone on, and so you can have someone on chat just like you would have in a normal classroom. So then that avoids that most important emotional base of learning, which is feeling connected with someone else, working on the same material, working together, working on the same lesson, but being able to chat, being able to discuss, being able to talk, being able to do all the things that students like to do when they're learning. I think that connection with other people has got to be maintained right through the remote learning environment. So if I was designing a post-pandemic ATL skills program, I would focus on that cluster of skills that we can call the skills of self-management, because those have got to be the critically important skills, and it's got to be a mixture of cognitive skills, metacognitive skills, but most importantly those affective skills I've been talking about that create the emotional base of successful learning. So what does that look like? Well, it's got to start, I guess, with time and task management. Now, time management is something that all teachers always insist on, but I'm not sure that it's taught explicitly to students. Students have got to know how to map out all the tasks they've got coming up. They've got to know how to timeline them. They've got to know how to prioritise them. They've got to know how to prepare to-do lists. They've got to be able to distinguish between the urgent and the important. You know, the urgent tasks are the ones that are required by other people. The important tasks are those that are more significant for the student. And the overlap between those two factors is critically important in time and task management. The second thing, I guess, is if they're organised, then they've got to learn the affective skills of self-motivation, of perseverance, how to overcome procrastination. Now, that's a critically important skill, but I'm not sure that students are ever taught how to do that. There are simple strategies students can learn which achieve those goals. Now, in the slide I'm showing you here, I have separated out the skills by colour coding. So the ones in green are the cognitive skills, the ones in red are the affective skills, and any that are in blue are the metacognitive skills. So let's imagine time and task management, self-motivation, overcoming procrastinating, generating urgency have been taught. What's next? Well, then students have got to learn how to set up their study environment. The room, wherever it is that they're working at home, can be set up in a way to help them concentrate, focus, and overcome distractions. And I have little exercises for students that I've created which help them to do all those things. They've got to learn how to create, set up and maintain digital collaborations. Digital online working with other students has got to be vitally important for all students in this new environment. They've got to learn how to set goals so that they achieve them. Anyone can write goals, but goal setting is a huge topic. In fact, when I run a workshop on goal setting, it's usually 3 to 4 hours teaching them a 16-step process of how to create goals in a way that gets them to achieve them, to take the steps necessary to achieve them. I think goal achievement is a hugely important ATL skill. Then self-assessment. Well, self-assessment, you see it's in blue there, it's a metacognitive skill. How to look at and judge the quality of your own output. To me, this has got to be one of the most important skills for remote learning, but also for all future learning, whether at school, university, or in any job. How to accurately judge your own output. That's got to be the key skill. And how to learn from mistakes and fail well. My whole failing well process, I think, works really well for students. How to get them to admit that they've made mistakes, analyse that process, that mistake, from the point of view of controllable factors and uncontrollable factors, to look at all the controllable factors, make changes to those that are going to make a difference to the output, going back and reprocessing that particular whatever it was that they failed at, and looking at the results and reflecting and reevaluating those results. That's the process of failing well. Once again, another affective, emotionally based skill, because admitting that you've made mistakes brings up all sorts of fears, particularly the fear of failure itself. Then searching and researching. Students have got to be really good at finding resources online and offline, and in particular for the online resources they've got to get good at comparing, contrasting, validating, verifying, being aware of bias and perspective in different platforms and different information sources, and of course IP rights and referencing are going to be critically important. How to summarise key points, both from written material in books, written material they find on the internet, podcasts and video presentations. Have they had training in how to pull out the key points and summarise those key points in a way that develops understanding? Those are critical skills. Also, building evidence-based arguments has got to be a very important skill. How to create a good evidence-based argument that can then be written in a report or presented to an audience, whether presented live or presented online. So those to me are the most important skills, and if you're interested in the framework of those skills, as I've said, it is available on my website, taolearn.com. But having outlined the skills, the next most important thing has got to be teaching strategies, doesn't it? So how do you teach these skills? Let me show you by using my Lalatette Framework. This is lalatette.com. So if you went to organisation, you've got, this is MYP, ATL skills, plan long-term assignments, meet deadlines. And down here we've got all the exercises. So let's go and have a look at how this would be done. So time and task management. Here we've got some information about time management, and here we've got the first task, which is to outline all the jobs, all the chores, all the tasks a student has got on in the coming week. So they list them in there. I've already filled those in. What happens in this exercise is once they've filled them in, they then come down, they automatically get filled into this table here. And this table here is asking students to make a decision for each task as to whether it's important or urgent. Now this is the Eisenhower matrix, made popular by Stephen Covey, and important tasks are those that help you to achieve your goals. Urgent tasks are those that help someone else to achieve their goals. So you make two decisions for each. Is it important or not important? Is it urgent or not urgent? And I've done this already. I've populated that table. So then once that's done, those tasks all drop down into this Eisenhower matrix. Here it is here. And there's some discussion, you'll have to have a look for yourself, but there's some discussion about what are the important areas to focus on. This is the urgent, important area. These are the deadlines. And this is the area where you can get most traction in helping to avoid deadline issues. So there's a whole lot of discussion about that. There is some explanation of the four sectors. And there's another exercise on reducing the pressure by taking strategic action, which means looking at all the tasks that end up in Sector 1 and Sector 3 and working out, is there work that you could do in Sector 2 to keep those tasks from appearing in the deadline-driven areas. There's another exercise on managing assignments to reduce stress, how to set up the various parts of an assignment so that you can achieve them, how to set goals to do that, how to get subject deadlines organised, tables here to fill in for students, those kind of things. That is a way to teach those particular skills. And if you look down here, the next task here is demonstrate persistence and perseverance. So if we go to that one quickly, demonstrate perseverance and overcome procrastination. How do you do it sometimes? You know, there are times when you do achieve good results, even when you feel like procrastinating and even when you are under pressure. So you've got to think about this and list factors in your control and factors out of your control in tasks you've done in the past. What are 3 things from the in my control column that you could use to keep yourself persevering with a task? What do your friends do? Connect with other people and see if you can find strategies they've got. How do you overcome procrastination? There's an exercise here which says, when you have serious coursework to do you ever find that suddenly you seem to find a whole lot of chores that need doing that you do instead of getting started? List those chores. When you have coursework to do you notice that you give yourself excuses or reasons why you don't need to get on with it right now? Write down those excuses. Make a list of all the things you use, like social media and computer games, to distract yourself from thinking about the tasks you need to get done. Displacement activities. An interesting discussion about that. Then an exercise on creating urgency. How do you get something urgent? You know, we can all get things done when they're due in tomorrow, right? Because we've got that sense of urgency. Is there a way to generate urgency which doesn't require you to have it due in tomorrow? And then an exercise on the single biggest distraction for students, which is their phone. All those exercises are available at lalatette.com. Have a look, check it out, and also visit us in the virtual exhibitor hall of this conference. We'll be pleased to talk things over with you. So I guess the main point that I've been trying to make in this entire presentation is that it is possible to teach ATL skills directly and explicitly. And I think I've proven that with, I have worked directly with over 50,000 students. I've worked indirectly with over 250,000 students in the last 25 years. And I think I've proved this 1,000 times over. And that a combination of these cognitive, metacognitive and affective ATL skills can have a profound effect on a student's academic success. And the third thing is that I truly believe that students can learn all the skills they need to become an effective self-managed remote learner, and they can learn those skills remotely. And that's the critical thing. So get in touch. These are all my details. There's the 2 platforms I'm involved with. There's my email addresses, my Twitter addresses, and my Facebook page. So I hope this has been useful for you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the exhibitor hall. Thank you very much, and goodbye.